Hello, and welcome to this next section of scientific ethics. So we just finished up looking at DNA and how we can kind of study the DNA and kind of learn about how we can identify individuals, or how we can do personalized medicine, or find out kind of the risk factors associated with genetic diseases and things like that. And then in the final section of the course, what we're going to focus in on is going to be taking a look at what happens if we actually go in and make changes to the DNA. Go in and kind of change that very important information that directs the activity of the cell. And by changing that information, we then can potentially change what the cells are doing and potentially cure genetic diseases, or change what's going on within the body. So in order to do that, we're going to start out first with the science. And so we're going to talk about how we get from the DNA, which we've already talked about a little bit, but from that DNA into the actual proteins that are going to be doing the things that the cell is going to be doing. The proteins are going to be the important kind of worker molecules within the cell that are going to determine the behavior. And in many cases, it's going to be damaged proteins or proteins that aren't working properly that are the cause of most diseases. And therefore, if we can kind of improve the proteins, make the proteins kind of correct or fix them, often by fixing the DNA, we can go through and correct these things. Okay, so to start out with, we got to take a look at the science. And so a little bit of the review. Again, don't worry about this. I just want you to get a flavor for what's going on. We've already talked about the DNA molecule. Starting as a double helix, we get that flattened double helix here. So we get the A's, the T's, the G's, and the C's on one strand, and the complementary strand here. And normally it's twisted and all of that. We've just flattened it out. But keep in mind that the DNA is going to be the location where we've got that important information. That's like that old encyclopedia that I told you about a couple weeks ago. This is the important information that's going to be directing what's going on within the body, what's going on within the cells. And it's going to be this DNA, this genetic information that's going to be passed from parent to offspring. Keep in mind that, like the encyclopedia, the old encyclopedia that we talked about, we're going to go in, we're going to make a temporary copy of our DNA molecule in the form of RNA. So again, we got the temporary copy here. So that's like going to the library in olden days, checking, or looking for the encyclopedia, making a copy of the page that you want to use, and then taking that back to your residence hall room and using it for a report or whatever that is. So we're going to go from DNA to RNA. And then the important thing is that we're going to go from this RNA, this temporary molecule, into the protein. And this is the process of translation. Don't worry about the names that we give these things. But we're basically going to take those nucleotides as A's, the T's, the G's, and the C's, and some modifications of this we're not going to worry about for the purposes of this course. But we're going to take those three letters and we're going to convert them into an amino acid. We're going to convert them into the building blocks of a protein. And the location of those amino acids are going to determine what that protein is going to be capable of doing. It's going to determine kind of the shape of the protein. It's going to determine the characteristics of the protein. But the important thing is that within the body, these proteins are going to be doing the molecular work. These are going to be, directing the activity that's going to be going on within the cell. They're going to be, little workers, if we want to think about worker molecules, if we think about it that way. And so we take a look at this. The proteins are going to be what's going to be involved with the biological work. And that's going to be occurring kind of in the normal sense. And in most disease processes, the disease is going to occur because the proteins aren't right. The proteins aren't being produced, or the proteins aren't working properly for whatever reason. So if we take a look at it, there are a lot of things that determine what the protein is going to be doing. One of the most important things is going to be the protein shape. And so the specific shape of the protein is going to help dictate whether or not that protein is going to be working properly. And so a good example of that, you go to fry an egg, you crack the egg, you've got the nice egg white, you take a look at it, it's kind of a liquid. You put it onto the hot frying pan, and you're going to see that kind of white liquid is going to become a white solid, as you fry up the egg. And what you're going to be doing there is taking a nice functional, protein within the egg whites, and you're going to be damaging them in a way. You're going to be damaging them in a way that they're, going to be non-functional. In that case, it's going to be, the protein sticking together and forming that cooked egg. So that protein is going to be very, very important to what we're going to be doing. but we're going to see that the protein is going to be doing a whole variety of different things in the cell. No one protein is going to be doing all of these things, but there are going to be some specialized proteins that are involved in structure. So they're going to give kind of rigidity to the body. They're going to give flexibility to the body. They're going to give some, I hate to use the word structure, but they're going to form as the kind of the building scaffold of the body, as well as filling in kind of all those little gaps. They're going to be proteins that are involved with movement. And so that can be like, the proteins in your muscles that allow your muscles to contract and move the arms and back and forth. But they could also be little transport proteins, proteins that are involved with moving other important molecules to different locations within the body. You've got transport proteins that are going to be pumping things inside of the cell, pumping things outside of the cells, grabbing things and moving them around throughout the body. Going to be many, many types of enzymes. Enzymes are truly kind of the workers within the worker molecules within the body, because it's going to be these enzymes. They're going to be proteins that allow for chemical reactions to occur within the body. And that's important because these chemical reactions, we can do them in a test tube in a laboratory, but under most circumstances, we don't have those enzymes present within the body, it's not going to work. And so those enzymes are going to be present there to, allow the chemical reactions, the kind of living, biological, biochemical reactions that are needed for life to occur within the body. And we need to have those enzymes. And in many cases, the damage to these enzymes mean we're not going to have the chemical reaction occur. And, like I said before, it's going to contribute to kind of an illness or a disease associated with it. And then finally, at least finally on this slide, kind of abbreviated version of what proteins are doing, we've got proteins involved with transport. And so they basically kind of similar to kind of the movement. We've got kind of special like tunnels into cells, little pumps going into cells. And so again, these are going to be kind of doing transport or almost like movement, kind of an individual little kind of salts and ions and things like that. They're going to be going on and moving in relationship to the inside and the outside of the cell, or moving in relationship to different regions within the body. So if we take a look at this, this is kind of a nice kind of artist's kind of rendition of what a protein looks like. And a protein is going to be this long chain of little balls, as the artist has illustrated it here. We've got a helix, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like a helix. It could be like a big kind of clump. It could be kind of a flat, kind of back and forth, forming a sheet. It could be, basically almost any kind of shape that you can imagine. But if we take a look at it, we're going to have these little balls, and these little balls are going to represent amino acids. And if we take a look at how the body's proteins are going to be built, we're going to see that there are normally going to be 20 different amino acids that are going to be present. And similar to the nucleotides we talked about with DNA, if we study the proteins, there are going to be some similarities. They're going to have the same basic structure, in this case kind of represented as the little ball, but that's kind of an artist's rendition as opposed to kind of a scientist's rendition. So the little ball is going to have the same basic structure. If we're studying organic chemistry, we can look at the atoms that are organized within the amino acid molecule. And then these amino acids are going to be hooked together, like these balls are going to be hooked together by forming chemical bonds. And so what we have as a protein is going to be a long chain of these amino acids, almost like little beads that we're going to be hooking together. Now, even though they've got a lot of similarities, that we can recognize them as amino acids, they've got the same structure, the same basic chemical bonds are going to be occurring. These 20 different amino acids, we're going to see that they're going to have different chemical properties. We're going to have some of them that are big and some of them that are small. We're going to have some that are positively charged and some that are negatively charged. Don't worry about that, but it's basically like kind of the poles on a magnet. The things that have like charges are going to be like the poles that are together, the same pole, North Pole and North Pole. You put those two magnets together, they're going to repel one another. If you put a North Pole and a South Pole of magnet together, they're going to attract one another. So if you've got a positively charged amino acid and a negatively charged amino acid within a region or a protein, they're going to want to try to come together and kind of form some structure and kind of hold that molecule together in some way, give it some shape. There are also, different amino acids that have different chemical properties, different kind of molecule kind of subunits associated with it that can give rise to its biological function. So again, some similarities, some differences, but the important thing to recognize is there are 20 different amino acids. They're going to be forming these chains, and kind of the length of the chain, the shape of the chain is going to be what's determining what that overall function of the protein is going to be. So if we focus in on these amino acids, what we're going to see is that we need to have these amino acids to be able to build the proteins, to be, have our body being functioning. So the amino acids are going to come from two sources. The amino acids can come from our diet. And so, if you eat proteins in plants or proteins in meat from animals, your body's going to digest those things down into individual little amino acids, and they're going to absorb them within your digestive system and make it available to the cells within the body. And so, amino acids coming from the diet. It's also possible that amino acids can come from kind of protein breakdown within the body. And so kind of breaking down other proteins, kind of almost like we're digesting it, but breaking it down into little subunits that we can recycle and build into other units. But in addition to that, we can also build some amino acids. And so basically what we're looking at is that within the body, basically we're going to have enzymes or other proteins that are going to allow us to build our proteins, build our amino acids that we can put together into our, just making a quick correction on this, onto our proteins. And so if we take a look at this, we're going to have, of those 20 amino acids, 9 of them are going to be essential amino acids. Essential amino acids basically means that they have to come from our diet. We can't build those ourselves. We can't make those amino acids. And so we need to have a good, rich diet to be able to produce those. The non-essential amino acids are the ones that we don't, they're not dependent upon our diet. These are going to be amino acids that we can kind of recycle and build from scratch within the body. But as you can see, in order to be kind of a good, healthy human being with good, healthy proteins, we got to have all 20 amino acids. So we've got to have those that are coming from our diet, as well as those that are coming, that are being built within the body. And so if we take a look at the essential amino acids, again, must come from the diet. So 9 of those 20 amino acids have to come from a dietary source. And this slide here shows what they are. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to ask you questions about this, but if you're concerned about your diet, these are things that you may want to look at to make sure that you're bringing them into your body, that you're having a good, well-rounded diet. And so in most cases, what we're going to be looking at is that most of the time the proteins are going to be coming from meat, coming from eggs. Alternatives to that would be things like tofu, soy, quinoa, as well as dairy products, as well as there's a variety of other plant proteins that we can bring in as well. Now, the non-essential amino acids are basically amino acids that can be synthesized within the human body. And so we're taking a look at the name non-essential. That's a little bit of a misnomer. We still need them within our body to be healthy. We still need all 11 of these non-essential amino acids to be able to build the proteins that we need within the body. But we can synthesize them. It's like within our cells, we got a little molecule set over here, and we can put together in the little balls and sticks. The sticks represent chemical bonds, the balls represent the atoms. Within our body, we can do the equivalent of this. We can synthesize these non-essential amino acids, these 11 amino acids that we need to be healthy, but we can produce them if they're not in our diet. Ideally, it's easier for us if we can bring in, a good, rich diet that has all of the amino acids so that our cells can do other things than building amino acids. So if we take a look at this, again, we got the essential amino acids, the non-essential amino acids, but there are also going to be some that are referred to as conditional amino acids. So conditional amino acids are usually not essential. And so basically it means that the body can build them if it needs to. But during periods of stress or during periods of illness, you may not be able to produce enough of these amino acids during the time period that you need. And therefore, again, another collection of amino acid names that you can take a look at. You can see them in the grocery store or the pharmacy, in the vitamin aisle. These are just kind of supplements. And so basically you would be taking these if you're sick under the doctor's direction normally. because your body isn't able to produce them, and you may not be getting them into your diet. And so if we take a look at this, the goal then is, again, you don't want the cell to have to work harder than it needs to. It's got to do a whole lot of other things. And if it's got to go back and kind of build these amino acids so you can build the proteins, it's not a good, efficient use of the cell. And so what you want to do within your diet, ideally, is to have complete proteins. And complete proteins are going to have all of the essential amino acids and a lot of the other amino acids that the body requires. And so generally, if we take a look at the traditional meats that are eaten in the human diet, those meats are going to provide the proteins that are needed for the body. So they're going to have kind of a complete set of those essential, and in many cases, the non-essential amino acids being present, so that your body's just going to, you're going to eat that food, your body's going to digest it, you're going to bring in those amino acids, and then the cells are going to use those amino acids from your diet to build the proteins. But not everybody eats meat, or not everybody has access to, kind of big quality meats or a variety of meats. And so because of that, some people often have incomplete protein foods or incomplete protein diets. And what this means then is that instead of getting it from a single source, like a hamburger here or a steak that would have all the complete proteins that we're looking at a combination of foods, some of which they have some of the amino acids, some of which have others of those essential amino acids. And so what you need to do, if that situation is affecting you, is that you want to kind of mix and match the right type of foods to give you a combination of foods within your diet. They're going to give you all of the essential amino acids that you need. And so example of that, a good classic example of that is if you take a look at, in this case, we've got refried beans over here, we've got some rice over here. Individually, each one of these is going to be an incomplete protein food. It's got some of those essential amino acids, but not all of them. This has some essential amino acids, but not all of them. But the combination of these two is going to give you all of the essential amino acids that you need. And so again, if you're taking a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet or a non-meat diet, what you're often going to do is have a variety of protein sources, and that combination of protein sources then is going to give you all of those essential amino acids that are needed by your body, so that you can build the proteins and have your proteins work, and so that you can be healthy. If we take a look at this, we said that the meats are going to be that complete source of proteins. But there are a lot of environmental and ethical concerns about meat production. And so what we're looking at here is, again, a rendition of a beef steer over here with all of the different cuts of meat kind of associated with it. But if you take a look at this, if you're going to have a big, kind of meat steer here, it takes a lot of space for that animal, in essence, to graze to get that big. It's going to take time. The animal, in this case, the steer, has to graze for years to grow up to be a good hardy animal that has a lot of meat on it that can be kind of sacrificed and then harvested for the food. And so it's going to have a lot of land devoted to it, a lot of resources in terms of water and fertilizer and things like that to have the grazing land. The prairies, almost, if you want to think about it, being a rich food source for this. It's fairly inefficient in terms of production of the biological energy. And so the steer is going to use up a lot of that energy just going through its daily life. And so not a whole lot of that grass energy that's stored up here, kind of grass the cow is eating, almost like the cow is eating like a vegan or vegetarian diet. He's eating plants. But very little of that plant energy, a small amount of that plant energy, is actually incorporated into the meat, incorporated into what would be the food source when we use this animal, the steer, as a source of our protein. We also take a look at how modern agriculture has addressed these meat production. They often, would treat the animals with antibiotics to prevent diseases. They'll treat them with hormones to promote growth. And there's a lot of concerns that having antibiotics and hormones in these animals is going to accumulate within the meat And if you eat that meat, then you could be exposed to the antibiotics and the hormones that are being present. And so there are a lot of concerns about that. And so alternatives to that are like free range farms or organic farms. Organic farms normally don't use fertilizer, don't use a lot of the chemicals. They don't use the hormones, things like that. Free range, we're not putting a lot of resources into kind of caged animals and a lot of fertilizer. We're allowing them to kind of go through, kind of graze their region, and then move them to a new location, allow that ranged region, that area that they grazed into to kind of recover. Then you bring them back and you kind of move the animals around to where they have a good, reliable food source. And so again, there are a lot of concerns associated with a meat diet. So if we take a look at it, and again, this kind of emphasizes the different sources of protein and the range of the environmental impact. And so just looking at a couple different examples. If we look at 100 gallons of water in terms of kind of resources that are needed for, keeping the animal alive, allowing it to grow and, mature to the point where, we can harvest the meat from it. 100 gallons of water is only going to be used to create about 6 grams of beef protein. So that's not very, very efficient. That's a whole lot of water, especially in regions that may be exposed to drought or limited resources of water. It's very efficient to use that water to produce beef protein. A little bit better if we take a look at chickens. And so chickens are about 3 times more efficient than beef. But if we take a look at this, and hopefully you can see where this conversation is going, if we take a look at it, crickets, 100 gallons of water can correspond to about 238 grams of cricket protein. And so that, is almost 40 times more protein for the amount of water that goes into it. We can take a look at the same things. This looks at water. We can take a look at land use. We can look at waste production, the amount of kind of waste that's being produced by these animals that needs to be processed. We can also look at carbon emissions from food. Again, we can take a look at kind of the equivalent amount of driving corresponding to a kilogram of food. And so it's a strange way to think about it, but again, shows you kind of the environmental impact. And so something like beef is like the same impact as driving a car. A kilogram of beef is the same thing as driving a Honda Civic sedan 176 kilometers. And so that's, not so good. But if you take a look at this, chicken is about 45 kilometers, so, roughly, a quarter of that. But then you take a look at lentils and tofu, you can see that they're much more kind of carbon neutral, not say carbon neutral, because they still have a carbon cost associated when they're still involved in producing carbon, but it's much, much less so. And so you're able to get much more protein, either in the form of lentil or tofu or even peanut butter over here, with a lot less environmental impact than what you'd have with things like beef and pork and chicken. And so if we take a look at this, there's an increased movement towards the production of food-based meats that are substitutes, that aren't using animal-based meats, but are using a plant-based substitute. And so the example of that came out a couple of years ago, the Impossible Burger. The Impossible Burger is this idea that you're being able to take plant proteins and produce something that has the same taste, same kind of nutritional characteristics as animal-based meat, but without the negative health and environmental effects associated with it. With the idea being that if we're able to use plant-based meats instead of animal-based meats, we'd have much less of an environmental impact, and it would be much, much more efficient. So if we take a look at this then, biotechnology, using some of the science that's available, is trying to figure out if, oops, sorry about that, biotechnology, use of science, is trying to figure out if we can come up with a way of generating cultured meat, generating meat that's not coming from an animal directly, but it's coming from a laboratory. And so what we're going to do with that is this idea, using some of the techniques that we've already talked about previously within the class, is that we start out with an animal over here, But instead of taking this animal to a slaughterhouse, killing it and carving it up and getting steaks and all of these different meat products out of it, what we're going to do is we're going to collect some of the cells, and we're going to take these cells, like the stem cells we talked about before, and grow them in the laboratory. And again, because we're working with stem cells, we've got almost this unlimited supply of these cells. And then we can grow them in the laboratory. And if we can figure out the right conditions, we can have these stem cells develop into meat cells, not meat cells within an animal, but meat cells within the laboratory. And if we do this right, potentially then we could generate this animal meat, animal flavored meat derived from animal cells, but it's not dependent upon producing an animal and all of the environmental impact and all the resources that need to go into this animal for it to grow up and serve as a food source. And so this is, just starting out here. It's kind of in its infancy, but there's this idea that we should be able to synthetically produce meat without having to go to a farm and getting it from an animal source. Another option for this is that insects. Remember that crickets that I talked about previously. The insects are an incredibly efficient source of protein. You're able to get a lot more protein per gram of insect than per gram of any other animal that's being present. And so if we take a look at this, again, globally, from that perspective, what's going on within the world, we can see that approximately 80% of the world's population already eats insects, at least as a source of part of its protein. And so us in the United States, we may kind of look at that as being kind of strange. You may go on vacation, eat a chocolate covered ant or something like that. But in the majority of the world, they're using insects as a protein source. And so if we can take a look at this, again, from a kind of biological perspective, we can say insects, got a big grasshopper, some kind of grubs kind of growing on in here within the spoon. We say, ick, I don't really want to eat a bug. But you think about it, lobsters, crabs, and shrimp are recognized and viewed as a delicacy, at least within our American culture. They tend to be very expensive. You find them in really expensive restaurants, and most people don't have them every day. They're the type of thing that is a special meal. But if you take a look at it from a biological perspective, lobsters, crabs, and shrimp are pretty close to insects. And if we can look at lobsters and crabs as being a delicacy, it's not that far down that slippery slope to say that, okay, maybe insects are an appropriate source of protein. This is something that's just starting to be looked at, but there are actually companies out there right now that are producing cricket flour, grinding up little crickets to produce flour that is a protein-rich flour that can be used in baking and cooking as an alternative protein source to using animal, at least mammal meat, cows, or even extending it more to pigs, or extending it into birds, if we're going to look at chickens or turkey. And so this is a direction that people are researching, and it is potentially a direction that we could be moving at some point in the future. So that's it for today's lecture. So I've got a few readings associated with this, thinking about the plant source and the ethics associated with it. So how test tube meat could be the future of food. It's about 6 years old now, so we made a lot of advances from that, but it again talks about it in a nice way, kind of explains the technology there. Generating meats from cells grown in the laboratory setting. Ethical protein, does it exist? The explosion of insect protein, this idea that we're moving away from types of protein that have a lot of resources, or at least a higher, huge environmental impact, and going to things that have a much less impact associated with it. And then finally, this idea of the protein of the future. This is a more recent article on the lab-grown alternative meat products and the ethics associated with that. So that finishes up today's lecture. Come back for the next kind of mini lecture where we talk about the activity for this. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you and have a great day.